Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Powerless Podcast. In this episode, I talked to Caroline Keroack, who is a postgraduate researcher at Brown University, is one of the founding members of the Brown Postdoc Labor Organization, the BPLO, as we'll refer to it mostly in the episode, and is a member of the bargaining committee of that union as well. Caroline and I talk all about the kind of importance and what led to them doing this unionization drive at Brown University, the push and pull and the nature when it comes to the response from the university, the overall picture of why it's important for unionization at academic institutions and at large within the American workforce, and some of the things outside of your typical salary negotiations and things of that nature that are vital to an academic organization, labor movement that Caroline breaks down really well here. So I want to thank Caroline for taking time out of her busy schedule to do this with me. I hope you all really enjoy it. This episode, we get really into the nitty gritty of what it takes to kind of kickstart a unionization effort and what you can do at your workplace, whether you're at an academic institution like Caroline or at any other job that you may work on a day-to-day basis, what you can do to start organizing with your coworkers and the benefits that come from that solidarity. So before we get into the episode, you can find the BPLO Union on Instagram at BPLO Union or at their website, bplounion.org. That'll be in the show notes below. You can follow the podcast on all social media platforms at thepowerlesspod. Email me at thepowerlesspod@gmail.com if you want to come on the show, if you're someone doing unionization efforts like Caroline was for this episode. If you're a musician, if you want to talk and break down your music, if you're a journalist and have some pieces you want to break down and talk about the current events and the current state of the political sphere of discussion and discourse, all those things and everything in between. I love to have people on to break down everything when it comes to art and culture and politics as well. So reach out to me there. Again, all that stuff will be in the show notes below, and I'll keep this nice and short. Here is my conversation with Caroline Keroack of the BPLO Union from Brown University. Thanks so much. All right, I am here for the next episode of the Powerless Podcast with Caroline Keroack, who is a postgrad researcher at Brown University, a member of the BPLO Union efforts, and who I've met through music community stuff in the past as well. So I know we just said this before we started recording, but thanks so much for taking your time today to do this. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you? And thank you for inviting me to be here.
Yeah, doing great. This is actually stuff that I've wanted to do more often with talking to people like on the, specificity of doing their own individual unionization efforts. I think it's good for people to hear, regardless of if I would speak to somebody who's one of the leaders of the union or just an active member, because I think a lot of times we see the unionization efforts that are big in sort of the headlines. You might see like big UAW union heads of like Sean Fain, who goes and like speaks with presidential candidates or something, and not to dissuade any of those at all, but I think it's great for people to hear about sort of on the ground grassroots efforts of like an individual unionization effort like you all are doing with the BPLO. So what I thought we would do today is talk a little bit about your background, where this comes from, kind of your history and working in this space and being a professional in this space, where the unionization effort came from, and kind of look at the big picture of the importance of unions in the space of like postdoctoral work and unions or universities at large. So with all that said, what I like to do kind of do an icebreaker, especially when it's not a music-based episode, which I do so often, is ask just kind of what have you been listening to lately music-wise? I know, again, that's where you and I have connected in the past. What has kind of been your on repeat? What are some bands you've been listening to a lot lately? Could be big ones, small ones, everything in between. Just what has been on your radar lately?
Yeah, I think because Sleep Token just dropped a new song, I've been back into a very deep Sleep Token rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But it's actually funny if you look at like my top 2 songs of the last 4 weeks. I like laughed out loud when I pulled this up. It's a Sleep Token and then it's a Pitbull song because I'm making my wedding playlist as well.
Yeah.
And then of course I've been listening to the new Silverstein album. So I think my top listening is very strange. It's like my normal, kind of metal emo music and then wedding playlist songs. So
Yeah. That new Sleep Token song, Emergence, is one that, like, I don't know. I don't know how they do it, that they kind of like build up this song that's like 6.5 minutes long, off of like, I don't know, just kind of building on the same chord progression or whatever, and yet it still
Yeah,
like pulls you in for 6.5 minutes. Where a lot of bands struggle to do that with 3.5. I don't know how they do it, but
I know, it's
I'm in a similar
crazy.
boat. I've been playing it. That and the newest Spirit Box album has still been on repeat for me. Uh,
And
so
I
yeah,
like, I'm trying to find a good Sleep Token song to play at my cocktail hour. And I'm like, these are all 8 minutes long. So that's
yeah,
like a tenth of the whole time. So
yeah.
yeah,
They gotta
got a
find. They gotta
couple
put out
shorter
a.
ones, but
They got to do what like Metallica did back in the day and put out like a radio version that's like cut in half somehow or something for
yep.
you, right? Yeah, no, that would be cool. Thanks for going over that. That's a reminder for me. I got to get back into the Silverstein record. I listened to it a couple of times, really liked it, which is like sacrilegious for me to not be like continuously listening to that. I feel like, but
It's like, it's
it's a
so
good one.
short. It just starts over and you're like, oh, we go again.
Yep, and putting out another one later this year, so that'll be fun to check out. Well, thanks for going over that. We'll get into like the more serious things here. Firstly, I guess it'd be kind of cool to hear your background. Where do you come from in this space for the BPLO Union? I know you've had quite a history of, being a part of Harvard, then Brown, very prestigious universities, doing a lot of work. If I remember right from our conversations with like communicable diseases and things of that nature. But tell me where I'm wrong. Just kind of your background here.
Yeah, so just in my science background, I'm a parasitologist. So I've studied parasites since undergrad. I've worked on parasitic worms and then parasitic protozoans. And so I work on a protozoan now that causes a disease called Chagas disease or American trypanosomiasis. Currently, that's a little bit of a scary field to be in. One, because it affects people in poverty in South and Central America, and it's an infectious disease, which, not to go on a tangent, but has become like an enemy of the government, which is just unbelievable. But in terms of unionization, while I was a PhD student at Harvard, I was actually part of the unionization effort for the graduate students at Harvard. And I wouldn't say a big part, but, tried to educate my department cohort about one of the things that's kind of tough about grad student unions is a lot of the STEM grad students were kind of resistant to it because we get paid the best in terms of stipend. So people were like, well, I don't really need this. And you're like, yeah, but other people do really need this. And there are other things beyond your salary that will really help you. I actually, it's not fun to go on strike, but I was a strike captain and, I'm a big fan of yelling into a megaphone. That's a good time for me. But when I got to Brown as a postdoc, we actually at Brown get paid the bare minimum salary for postdoctoral researchers. And I didn't quite realize that when I got to Brown, I was getting a raise, but after like taxes and health insurance and everything that gets taken out, I was actually making less money as a postdoc than I was as a graduate student. And I think, grad students deserve the salaries that they get for sure. And I was just like, I now have this advanced degree and it's pretty disrespectful to pay less than the grad students for your postdocs. So we actually started, I am the president of the Brown Postdoc Council, and that is not affiliated with the union at all, but I met some really incredible people there. And we put together a petition this was very successful at Princeton. They put together a petition and petitioned their upper administration to give them a raise to $65,000 a year, and Princeton granted that raise. We put together the same petition at Brown to get a raise to 65,000. At the time we were making 56,000 was the minimum. And Brown took that petition, had a listening session, and then did nothing. So from there, we realized that this petition really had no power because we had no collective action behind it and no union behind it. So me and another couple of postdocs decided that we needed to unionize. The postdocs at Brown, after seeing the success that the postdocs at Columbia had in unionizing, Columbia got a very large salary increase and a lot of improved benefits. And we actually talked to some of the leadership, the postdoc leaders for the Columbia Union, and we talked to some representatives from larger parent unions, because usually you have to affiliate with something like UAW or something like that to support your union. And the graduate students at Brown are unionized with AFT, so the American Federation of Teachers, I think. And so they have a union called GLOW, the Graduate Labor Organization. And so we had decided to go with AFT as well, just so that we could all be part of the same local at the end. Became BPLO, which is the Brown University Postdoctoral Labor Organization. I started this in 2022, and we, for months and months and months, talked to postdocs one-on-one, just walked around to labs, offices, walked in, and we're like, hey, do you have a second to talk? and just gauged whether or not people were interested in this. In 2024, that is when we won our official recognition from Brown University. We filed our petition with the NLRB, and Brown actually voluntarily recognized the union without us having to hold an election, which was cool. And that's sort of where the coolness of Brown has ended. We have been bargaining with them since March of 2024. It's been very long. I am one of the co-chairs of the bargaining committee. I was one of the main leaders of our organizing committee, so I still work there. And I think one thing that's really powerful for me coming out of this is that you, as an individual, if you find other people like you, can build these sorts of things from the ground up. And I think one thing that we always try to tell all the postdocs is like, this is not a third party. AFT didn't just come in and decide that they wanted to unionize. We built this with the support of some of these union organizers.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, thanks for going over all of that. I think it's good for people to hear the sort of background of where you can kind of build this from, where you can, and kind of the difference. I think what's interesting there, right off the bat, before we kind of look at things broadly, is the idea of you going sort of not informally, but without the union, your council that you're talking about, having these things that you see another university doing. By no means what someone might defer to as like a radical proposal. And since you don't have that official collective effort, that they feel that they can very easily shut it down, right? So that's where I think a lot of the like formally recognized unionization efforts are a big step in kind of, having this more organized, contentious relationship with administration or whatever the case may be. But you alluded to something there that I think would be important to kind of hit on, which you said it's not just about salary, right? Which, again, like you said, coming to Brown doing postdoc work, you would think that would be a better pay than graduate students and all that disparity. But it's not just about salary. It's about a lot more than that. It can be anything, I'm guessing, in your all's field, from protection of the research that you're doing to stability and a lot of different benefits in different ways that would, bring a lot of benefit, not just to the unionized workers from the specific union you're a part of, but kind of set the bar in some ways for even ununionized workers at the university. So can you kind of speak to that a little bit? What are some of the other things that you've noticed that are important for you all when it comes to organizing beyond just salary? With salary is what everyone thinks of with unionization, but what are some of the other important aspects that you've kind of learned through the process of this?
We talked to at least 200 postdocs when we were going around trying to figure out what our bargaining platform was going to be. And the top three things that came out of that were obviously like compensation and salary, but then in health insurance and other benefits, including childcare and hardship fund assistance and uh, healthcare, dental, retirement, all those sorts of benefits. And then finally, we don't have the exact number because we don't ask people their citizenship status for very obvious reasons. But, just from talking to folks, about probably 50% of the postdocs at Brown are international scholars. And that was one of the biggest, like most important things to have in our bargaining, in our contract. And obviously that has only become more and more important as time has gone on. And so for international scholars, we really wanted folks to have the university's full support behind them. So should you need immigration legal support, if you get detained, if you get stopped at the border, if you get deported, that Brown will both provide legal and financial assistance to you should that happen. And then, of course, one of the things that a lot of these scholars want is the choice of visa and sponsorship for those visas. So the two major visas that postdocs work on are called the J1 visa and the H1B visa. And they have their benefits for each person. And then obviously people just want the freedom to choose. And at Brown, a lot of people end up on a J1 visa, even if they don't want that. Brown also, we were trying to bargain for extended contracts because Brown only really signs 1-year contracts, which means that international scholars have to go home every single year to renew their visa, which if you think is like a really inequitable system where like I'm an American citizen, so I don't have to spend thousands of dollars a year to go back and renew my work visa. Whereas, the other postdoc in my lab does. And so that's money that she has to spend that I don't. So that leads to inequity in postdocs. And then I would say postdocs, a lot of times we get called students, which we're not students anymore. And postdocs tend to be in their 30s, and postdocs
Right.
have children. Not all of them. A lot of us don't have kids, and folks have obviously made the decision to not have children because you don't have financial stability. That's a whole different can of worms. But the postdocs that are parents really need like childcare assistance, and Brown offers very, very little childcare assistance right now. It's income-based, and most people get rejected. If you look, for example, at Princeton, they pay $5,500 a year per child. So that's something you can apply for. And obviously, childcare is astronomically expensive, but that's $11,000 a year for childcare you didn't have. Brown maybe will give you $1,500 a year if
which
you
is gone in like a month.
yes,
Yeah,
like
right.
literally, that's not even 1 month of childcare.
Yeah.
And you think, and that's total, not like per child. That's it. And the childcare, obviously, Brown is in Providence, but childcare in Boston can be like $50,000 a year. So it's crazy. And it's like Brown doesn't offer daycare services or anything like that. And the daycares are full. People need childcare, so they're having trouble finding childcare. That was a really big problem from postdocs. And I think one thing that's important to know about, unionizing is that you can bargain for anything. You can decide, like, I want this thing, and you put it in the contract and you just see where it goes. So we actually just introduced 2 articles, new ones, in the last 2 months or so. We had an article on academic freedom, which we had previously not had, but the Harvard non-tenure track faculty and postdocs just unionized as well. And we've been in contact with them, and they had a really beautiful academic freedom article that they had proposed, which essentially is like protection of free speech and ability to control how you build your classes, and your protection to have your own opinions and do things if you are outside of Brown and not be penalized for protesting or anything of that nature, or your opinions. And so we took that, and we also took an article for protections for artificial intelligence implementation, and thinking about how AI comes in, not only replacing your job, but surveilling you. So going through records and using AI to look at records. And so we wanted protections for both of those things. And that's just, not salary based at all, but workplace conditions. And those are the less flashy articles to bargain over, sort of these mechanics and workplace articles, but they are really just as important. One of the other things that we bargained for a very long time, and unfortunately we actually filed with the NLRB to try and get this, but Brown University has several affiliated hospitals, and postdocs work at those hospitals. They were hired by Brown, but their paycheck comes from the hospital. So like they get paid by Lifespan or the VA, but they're faculty members affiliated with Brown. So in our argument was that is a Brown employee and they deserve to be part of the bargaining unit. Brown disagreed, and we disputed it with the NLRB. And last year, there actually was a decision that would have gone very, very much in our favor, that was essentially saying anyone who handles any part of your employment can be considered an employer. That was unfortunately overturned in one of the lower courts, and for many political reasons that happened, and the NLRB ruled against us. So the affiliated postdocs are not considered part of the bargaining unit, but we are, and this also goes for fellows. So one thing that I think some folks don't know about postdoctoral research is that you can apply for independent funding. You still work in the same place, but you get paid on your own. For example, I have an NIH fellowship. It's a little tenuous now, but it's called an F32. But the way that my fellowship gets dispensed is the money goes to Brown, and then my paycheck still comes from Brown. So I still count as a bargaining unit member. For the National Science Foundation, so an NSF fellowship, those postdocs get paid directly by the NSF. So Brown is like, you're not an employee here. Even though I could be working in the exact same lab, an NIH and an NSF fellow, that person doing the same job in the same place is no longer considered an employee. So they don't get to be part of the bargaining unit either. But this is not to say they can't receive benefits. So we're actually drafting a side letter to put in at the end that's like, these benefits extend to all postdocs at Brown, regardless of pay source. And that's something that is true for graduate students as well. So graduate students can have fellowships from the NSF, the NIH, the DoD. There's lots of places to get funding, even private. The American Heart Association gives out fellowships too. Sure, there's tons of other ones, but the grads have a side letter protecting. So if you have an NSF fellow as a grad student, you still get all the benefits that grad students in the bargaining unit get. So that was a really big contentious thing. We argued with them for a really long time. And, Brown could at any point in its life do the right thing and just accept those postdocs as employees of their university, considering that Brown just committed $150 million a year to buy Lifespan. They won't say they bought Lifespan, but that's one of the hospitals. They rebranded it, and now it's called Brown Health, and they one are like, we're so broke, we can't do anything. And I'm like, okay, we didn't have to buy that hospital. But so, and I'm like, and you still don't think those people are your employees. So it's very frustrating. And they could at any point just do something reasonable and accept those postdocs.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the through lines between postdoc labor organization all the way down to like the more what people think of with typical unionization efforts of like a warehouse job or a blue collar gig or anything of that nature, where the scheme is just across the board trying to have employees without calling them employees, just so that way they don't get the same defense as maybe some of the others, right? And as you said, like it is a framework of just collective benefit, where it's just the fact that you're sitting next to these people and they're doing similar work as you, but just because the pay technically comes from somewhere else, all of a sudden they don't get any of the benefits that you're fighting for, and they're being very contentious with you on. But it's just, I don't know, it's very eye-opening to see that, like, from some more of a like normie type person like me that doesn't interact directly with a lot of university endeavors and mechanisms of it, that it's still the same tactics that they play day in and day out, right? It's just, I don't know, it's not surprising, but it's still disappointing to hear that's how people running some of the most well-known academic institutions in our country or in the world still use that same playbook, right?
All the there's three people on the university bargaining team, and one of them, his entire job is this. So they hired him to negotiate contracts and run labor relations. And they use every classic union busting thing you could imagine from any union and, try to turn people against the union. And one of the things they did that was so frustrating was the salary at Brown is set by something called the NIH stipend minimum. The NIH publishes what is, it's not a law, you don't have to follow it, but they put what they believe to be the acceptable minimum salary for a postdoc. And Brown has always used that since it's existed to set postdoc salaries. The NIH last year in April released an increase in the salary minimum from about $58,000 a year for a entry level postdoc to $61,000 a year for an entry level postdoc. And we asked Brown, you always we're bargaining, but you always implement these raises when they come through the NIH. Will you do that? And all Brown had to do that legally was discuss. The union says yes, then you can implement the salary. You can change things during bargaining, but they kept telling everybody, oh, we can't do it because we're bargaining. We're not allowed to change anything because we're bargaining. And we're like, that's just not true. Like, what you're doing is illegal. We actually filed an unfair labor practice. The NLRB is obviously very backed up, and a small academic union is not their major priority. But it looks, Brown is actually the university that probably gets the most ULPs filed against them. If you look it up, they have many of them because they love unfair labor practices. And we actually had to bargain with them for 2 months over this salary increase that we should have just gotten. And they finally agreed to it in like a interim agreement article where we got the raise and back pay, lump sum back pay. But we did have to concede that if we wanted to take strike action, we have to give them 3 weeks notice, which was the only way we could get that. So it's not an ideal, but we really wanted postdocs to get this raise. And we know that they were holding that raise up to try and make people frustrated with the union, being like, hey, if you hadn't unionized, you would have just gotten this raise, which is like classic union busting technique. And then they try to be nice. And ever since that article, they're like, we came together really well to get that interim agreement done. And like Brown really cared about doing that. And like, if you really cared about doing it, you would have just given us the raise instead of wasting 2 months of 5 postdocs' time on the bargaining committee. So yeah, they're not all that different from any other union or any other employer. They're, I would say less nasty than some employers. Like, we're not worried so much about getting fired. And, you look at what's happening at Starbucks, and the things there are really, really contentious and really nasty. And it's not quite to that level, but they still use a lot of the same tactics that you hear about.
Right. In some ways, it's, Brown is not going to be able to shut down a branch that unionizes the way a lot of these other places can, right? They do have to work with you all. Not to say that anyone unionizing at a Starbucks isn't vital to the organization. But I mean, they can't exactly just usurp all of their postdoc workers, that are such a vital aspect of the university. But yeah, I mean, it goes. There's a clip, I think, or a video that you all shared on your social media that one of your members that was speaking said something. I alluded to it earlier, and you kind of talked about it a little bit, but I thought was really strong of that you went to the bargaining table. Maybe you can speak more into the details of this in whatever way you feel comfortable, but that they said, that part of what Brown's response was to some of your demands was that giving this to you all would mean that they're giving you things that they don't give everyone else at the university, which is another cop out that is, tried and true in the anti-union playbook. But the simple answer that your fellow union organizer, I believe, said was, well, that the point is then to give that to everyone. Then you're actually like making our case for us. So I guess when you've come to the bargaining table with things like that, what are some of the you've kind of given some of them already, but what are some of the responses you've received, and just how has it been since most recent, I guess, attempt to meet them at the bargaining table?
So one of the things that's really frustrating about bargaining right now is that we're not bargaining with anybody who has power to actually make a decision. So everything we say at the bargaining table has to like go to the president of Brown. And we're like, why doesn't Christina come here then? I want the person that can make decisions in the room. And I will say, that is one that comes up. A lot of times we'll submit a proposal and they'll rewrite it to be like, as written in the handbook for faculty guidelines. And we're like, well, if you change the handbook of faculty guidelines, then you need to negotiate with us about that. And they will say, well, the faculty guidelines covers many more people than the postdocs. And so we couldn't do that. Like, okay, then you're going to agree to our article and we're going to work under our collective bargaining agreement. So that is something we go back and forth on a lot. We actually just, for academic freedom, that was something they put into everyone was like, as in the handbook, as in the handbook. And we put in for our last counter proposal, a clause for reopening the article. So should they change anything, this automatically reopens for negotiation with the union. So that's been something that's really annoying. And they've never said it explicitly out loud, but they don't want to give too much of a raise because then that means they have to give raises to everybody. Okay, then give raises to everybody. They deserve it. You know that.
Yeah, shucks. People get money, Yeah.
So
Right.
one of the things that happens in a lot of postdocs is around your fifth year, you get promoted to something called a research associate. And it's really just because they don't like the metrics for having postdocs be there longer than 5 years. And a lot of postdocs in the life sciences in particular last a very long time because getting a faculty position is really difficult. And so you just kind of get trapped in this postdoc. But it gets capped at 5 years. So look at all our postdocs are done in 5 years. Not, I know postdocs that have been a postdoc for 11 years, but, became a research associate. And those research associates aren't in the bargaining unit right now. They're very hard. One of the things that was so hard about organizing postdocs is they're so spread out and there's no place. It's not like you take classes together. We don't go to work together. So it's really hard to find those people. The Brown doesn't publish a directory of postdocs. So we really had to we wrote a really talented undergrad actually wrote us an algorithm to scrub the directories to find people with postdoc titles. And then we just had to show up and go because, you get 1,000 emails a day. You get an email from a random person. You're just going to be like, whatever. So if I show up at your desk, that's sort of like, oh, I guess I have to talk to her. She's here. But so that's what made it really difficult and it became a really daunting task to try and get all the non-tenure track faculty on board, but that's something we would like to do in the future. It's right now we're obviously focusing on bargaining.
It seems that they just really do everything at their disposal, like we've talked about, to fracture people, to make it, like you said, less easy to connect. That's another thing that can happen across various jobs. I kind of am dealing with that in my own efforts with some things with people that are very disparate, but technically the same employees that never see each other face to face, and that unique challenge that makes things even more difficult when it comes to organizing. I guess when you first started doing that, because I think this is again important for people to hear if they're interested in unionizing. What was the initial response when you went to speak with people that, these essentially strangers that were your colleagues? Was the overall response when you spoke to them that most people were pretty accepting? Did you have to really educate and kind of break down in some of the propaganda that people have had in their heads for years? What was kind of the overall response there when you first started getting this collective organizing going?
I think for the most part, a lot of people were overwhelmingly supportive or pro-union, and I think, being in academia at this high of a level kind of selects for people that have that kind of mindset. I think one of the greatest things we heard in terms of like not wanting to unionize was just fear of retaliation, which is always like founded fear. And so just talking through that. And one of the things the union itself, the AFT affiliates, are really good at are training people to have unionizing conversations with people. And so one of the things that we always do is, and I would do this anyway, is just like, what is your experience being a postdoc? And listening to people's concerns and really trying to be an active listener, and not doing that for ulterior motives, but actually wanting to hear about other folks' experiences. And I've talked to maybe 200 postdocs at this point, and a lot of people, I've only ever ran into a few people that were like really anti-union, and those, I think, more bad experiences or predisposed notions of what they think unions are. Some people were afraid of harming faculty by unionizing, and I'm always try to remind people that like we're trying to raise all ships here, including faculty, and that Brown has a $7.2 billion endowment, and they can absolutely afford to do these things. And just reminding people that, Brown isn't your friend. At the end of the day, you don't need to be protecting their interests. They should be protecting yours. I think our initial conversations were really just like, how do you feel about unions? Would you support postdocs unionizing at Brown? One thing that was interesting is because so many graduate students have started unionizing, we actually ran into a lot of people that had experience with their grad unions and felt pretty positive, and few people felt negative about it. But one of the most important things is reminding people that this is built by your coworkers. It's not built by a third part. So people were like, well, I just don't want UAW to come in and like take our dues and not listen to us. And we're like, that's not what's happening here. And that has happened in some places. But what's happening here is the union is run by postdocs. We don't even have like a union representative on our bargaining table sitting with us at bargaining. It's just 5 postdocs trying their best to bargain. We obviously have strategizing sessions with people at the union. We have a lawyer that we can talk to about things, but they don't bargain. They don't ask for things from us, but that's all up to us. And I would say in the beginning, there was some hesitation. Obviously, it's really fear of retaliation is what you heard the most from people. And then the second conversation you have when things start getting serious is asking people to sign the union membership cards. You want to have at least a 2/3 majority of postdocs or anyone in your workplace signed. If you can have a super majority, that's better. And that's what needs to get filed to the NLRB, are these membership cards along with your petition for unionization. That actually went pretty well. And sometimes you had to talk to someone multiple times. And, the more people that joined, the less people were afraid. And it really helped to have the grad student union there and be like, Brown did not retaliate against the grad students. No grad students got kicked out for unionizing. Obviously people are also afraid of their direct supervisors. So like I work in a lab and I have a boss, and luckily my boss is pretty cool about all of this stuff, but not everyone's boss is cool about these things. Obviously, like we talked to one postdoc whose boss told them that their job was 24/7 and they were not entitled to vacation. And I was like, you, sir, very much need a union.
Yeah, no
kidding. And so, yeah, it's you're really beholden to your direct supervisor. And we try to tell people like, that's what this contract is for, is to protect you from, if you do not have a benevolent PI supervisor, lab head, program director, this contract should protect you from that. And just listening and telling people, they'd be like, well, I don't really care about getting a salary increase. I'm like, do you care about having more vacation time? Do you care about having better health insurance? Do you care about having protections from immigration issues? Do you care about all kinds of, like, do you care what kind of computer you get when you come here? That's something we negotiated into or are actively negotiating, is like the right to choose what computer you need for your job, the right to have things reimbursed in a timely fashion. A lot of things of that nature, and just to protect you from your direct boss, and as well as like the higher the boss's boss's boss.
Yeah, I mean, I think that fear of retaliation, that is probably the biggest hurdle for people to jump, aside from someone that is just rampantly like anti-union for whatever the case may be. That kind of goes into, obviously we've seen a lot of news lately, kind of pulling this in and connecting it to current events a little bit, of a lot of seeming, not specifically at your school, I haven't seen this, but just at large in universities, of people being targeted, I would use the word abducted, or at the very least expelled or suspended or whatever the case may be, for various, whether it would be their immigration status, and or basically them utilizing their right to free speech on campus. um is that something that kind of goes under these umbrellas that you're talking about when discussing like freedom of freedom of academia, freedom of educate, all those different things? Is that something that you all thought about? Is that something you continue to kind of put at high stake as things go on? Kind of what is your sense of that in relation to unionization efforts and just being a member of a university in general?
Yeah, that's something we think about a lot. And we actually, we have a committee that represents the full local, not just like our branch BPLO. So at Brown, the academic, it's the local 6516. And the workers, I might miss some. And because there's a lot of unions now, there are several undergrad unions, which is awesome. They have such incredible energy. But so we work with the grad union, the undergrad unions. We've actually had a lot of support from like the unionized library workers, which is really cool. All the, professional unions at Brown as well, trying to have sort of cross local organizing efforts to protect graduate students, to protect postdocs. We just put out guidance for graduate students and postdocs as well for traveling and being safe and what you need to bring with you if you're traveling. And it's guidance that Brown is really not giving. Brown just essentially sent an email saying, don't travel. And you're like, well, what if I have to? Because you've given me a 1-year visa and I need to renew my visa. So, I have to travel. And telling me not to is not great advice. So we tried our best to like put that advice out. I think one of the things that has been heartening for me to see is just like the power and effort and things that go into collective action and the labor movement, and seeing all of these people coming together and knowing that like if the labor movement can really take off and work across, like we have representatives from very large unions come to rallies that we have, and just knowing that if we all do this together, you can really make a difference. We've talked a lot about strategies for trying to stop students from being detained, abducted, taken away, surrounding a car, trying to like building a wall around these people, like just different things like not letting ICE take you away if I can help it, giving people resources. If ICE shows up in your building, lock the door, they can't come in without a warrant, just sort of these guidelines for what to do in those situations. And that's something that the unions are doing and Brown is not. Brown has been very silent. And you look at what's happening at Columbia, and a lot of people are very, very scared. And I don't blame them. It's really scary. We just saw a student taken off the street in broad daylight as a Tufts graduate student that's up the street in Somerville from me. And, you saw all these videos go around online that's like, Boston would never let that happen. And you're like, well, what did you do? So, in that video, there's a guy that just walks right past, didn't even say like, hey, what's going on? But
Yeah.
that's the bystander effect is real, but trying to be aware that this is happening around you and what can you do and what resources can you give people. And I think that's part of the power of a union, is providing protections to people when your employer doesn't want to do that.
Yeah. And just to, that the video of that graduate student, I believe, right? Or doctoral student. Yeah. Tufts University, Rumeja Oster. I watched that video just maybe a day late or something. I've been really busy and not glued to the endless doom scroll of daily news as much as I usually am.
That way.
Yeah. Yeah. But then, you see a video like this, and I had it on, and like without the context of an article, it would look like every stop human trafficking video,
It
kind
looked
of
like this
people
woman
out there.
just got kidnapped off the street.
With a bunch of people in all black with masks on. I mean, it was right out of like the most dystopian thing I had ever seen. And yeah, I mean, that's basically what I've heard, from, obviously the more publicized stuff with Columbia, where they're completely like, kneeling to all this kind of, what I would say is fascistic behavior of the government. And I'm not surprised to hear that at a Brown or numerous other universities, maybe they're not putting out a public statement saying like, we will comply with ICE or whatever that Columbia's sort of been doing. But it is like not surprising that they're basically not doing their due diligence. So it is great to hear that that's something the unionization efforts, not just with you, but seemingly at a lot of universities, are taking stake in. One other, I'm kind of going all over the place here, but one other thing, I don't want to take too much more of your time here. I'll ask you just a couple more questions. With the NLRB, you've mentioned that a few times. Like we said earlier, neither one of us are lawyers. We're not going to go into the deep nitty gritty stuff. That's what other people work out. But there was a lot of talk, because you have obviously been doing this unionization effort for several years now. At this point, a couple of years officially since 2024. Have you noticed a response from the university or things related to the NLRB between the previous Biden administration and what you've been doing recently under the Trump one? A lot of people, I think, put a lot of stake into, for all the false people could say about the Biden administration, the Democrats, that they were good on the NLRB. That's what I kept hearing from pundits. That's what I kept hearing from journalists and different people that supported the Biden administration. And obviously that's taken a turn publicly to some degree, the NLRB under the Trump administration. Have you noticed there's like a change at all in these negotiations? Have you noticed anything at large with like the unionization effort, or has it kind of been a lot more of the same than maybe what people like to allude to in the daily discourse of national politics, if that makes sense?
I actually think there's been a fairly dramatic change, and the NLRB is becoming a lot more conservative. Under the Biden administration, there were a lot of things that went into effect that were really favorable for workers and allowed more workers to be covered by unions. And those things started getting overturned. Like I talked about, that conservative judge actually overturned the ruling that, an employer was considered an employer no matter how much of their employment they handled, if they handled any of it at all. One of the things that, in terms of academic unions, one of the priorities, it seems, of the Trump administration is to get rid of grad student unions. And this is always an argument that, like, they're students, they're not workers, but graduate students provide invaluable services and work to universities, both through their research and teaching. Graduate students do an enormous amount of teaching at these large universities, and they get paid very, very, very little to do it. And that is why they deserve to be considered employees in addition to students. And I believe it is the Columbia decision is what it is called. I could be wrong on that, but the Columbia decision was the NLRB decision that allowed graduate students to be considered employees. And one of the, as we've been told by our parent union, AFT, the Trump administration seems set on getting that overturned. And so the NLRB is kind of like the Supreme Court in that it works on precedent. So it's not like you can go and overturn a decision, but a new decision can be made that sets the new precedent. And so one of the major things that has happened is these graduate student unions do not want to give the NLRB the opportunity to set a new precedent. So grad student unions, like, there's been a global halt on submitting new petitions to form unions, because that would give the NLRB a chance to say, no, you actually aren't employees anymore. And that puts everything into disarray. It's also preventing graduate student unions from being able to file unfair labor practices, because, again, that gives the NLRB an opportunity to set new precedent. And it's actually guidance that's being given to postdoc unions too, because like I said, a lot of people are like, well, postdocs are kind of students, which we absolutely aren't, but we don't want to give them anything to latch onto to be able to overturn or set a new precedent from the Columbia decision. So that's one of the major things that we're seeing in academic unions. I can't speak to other unions quite as much, but I know that the Trump administration is very anti-labor and anti-union. It's just really ironic to think about. My fiance is a union glazer and has very, very good benefits. And most of his colleagues probably voted for Trump. And I'm like, your great salary and benefits came from a union, and you just voted for someone who wants to get rid of that. So explain that one to me.
Yeah. And of course, you and I both have very, very resounding issues and horrible things to say about things with the Biden administration. But one thing you can say that is very different between the two parties still is something like the NLRB, right?
I will say, like you said, I have a lot of problems with that administration. One of the really good things they did, actually, they had a very good track record on labor decisions. That is where I would leave my feelings on that administration.
Yeah, no, agreed. I get you. I guess again, thanks so much for going over this. This has been really interesting. I think informative for people, regardless if they're at a university or anywhere else, just to kind of see the backstory of developing a union from the ground up and all these different things. One, I guess I'll just ask this last thing, and then you can just kind of say where people can follow the union, follow your work, and just kind of see where this grows and how they can support and things of that nature. When you started doing this, or as you've been a part of these unionization efforts, if you were speaking to somebody, that wanted to do the same thing, but is literally working from the ground up, has no idea where to start, has no clue, like how does this happen? Because a lot, to me, it's unfathomable, the first step, kind of, right? It's like the missing link, so to speak, right? You're just not quite sure where to go to start these things. What would be your advice to somebody, as someone that's done this, to start a unionization effort within their workplace?
Say, like, I have a PhD, but it's a PhD in biology. I am not an expert on labor law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even a historian. I don't know anything about unions. So the first thing I'll say is, like, don't feel like you have to know a damn thing about a union to build one. What you need to be able to do is talk to people and try to build a network. And I think one of the most powerful things we did was reach out to colleagues at other universities that had unionized and ask them, how did you do this? And that's like step one. So, you don't have to work at a university. You can just reach out. I got a buddy who unionized this thing down the street, and you talk to them. You reach out to a union. It's so, like, we reached out to the representative for Columbia, who worked at UAW. So we talked to the UAW person, and those people give you a lot of advice on how to start. The most important place to start is just talking to people about, like, yeah, I think we need a union. And then it does feel unfathomable that we went from there to bargaining. And just, like, I'm bargaining now, and I once again have no experience with that. And I think you have a lot of skills, just interpersonal skills, help to build these sorts of things, and being able to network with your colleagues and not being scared to reach out to people. So the first very, very beginning, there were like three of us. And then we had that, we go way back to that petition, that listening session. There were some really angry postdocs in that listening session. And we emailed them and we're like, hey, do you want to help us build this union? And so we got more people on our organizing committee from that, and just recognizing that there are people that are willing to do this work with you. You don't have to do it alone. Then we talked to UAW to get advice, and then we reached out to the AFT representative for GLOW, and that's who we started working with, and they really helped us. And I think that's where you get the nitty gritty of, like, what do I have to do? What is every step I need to take to actually build this union? So that would be my advice. If it's something that you really want, just find somebody who's done it. And, you can Google people, you can talk to people. Most people that have unionized and built a union are very friendly, and they would like to help you. So
Yeah.
I think the people we talked to at Columbia were amazing, and NYU as well. Really amazing people.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's another important thing to remember, is just like there is all of this groundwork built out there. It's just, you have to have people at your work willing to connect in person, right? In
And I'll say, like, I
2025,
have social anxiety. So I actually put myself into this because I wanted to get better at talking to people, because networking as a scientist is really important too. And so, yeah, it is really scary to walk into somebody's lab and, like, cold ask them stuff, but it gets easier, and, you meet a lot of really interesting people. I have learned so much about what it means to be a postdoc outside of the life sciences, because, my view of it was very small. I've been very specialized field of biology for quite some time, and just learning, like, what does a history postdoc look like? What does a literature postdoc look like? What does a physics postdoc look like? Just really interesting places and people that you get to meet. And, maybe you meet someone who has a great idea. You get to work together on something else, but realizing that you have an opportunity not only to build a labor movement, but to find really, really cool people and maybe friends and colleagues, and just building some solidarity so you don't feel so isolated at work if it is an isolating work situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thanks. I think that's a great way to kind of end things off here. Carolyn, thanks so much for going over all this. This is really, really great conversation. Just kind of share where people can, follow the unionization effort, follow what you all are doing. And then one last thing I do, even though it's not a music episode, I always play a song at the end of the episodes. And I let the guests pick it. Just kind of share where people can follow things, and then pick a song to play at the end of this.
I know. You can follow the union. You can follow all of our bargaining. We have a bargaining tracker on our website, which is bplounion.org. So bplounion.org. We are on Instagram. I believe it's BPLO Union. That is our Instagram handle. We used to have an X/Twitter, but got rid of that because obviously not wanting to support certain people anymore. So most of our updates come from Instagram. You can see we collaborate a lot with GLOW. So that's the Grad Labor Org, I believe is their handle for the Brown Graduate Student Union. You can see updates coming. They're also pushing really hard for some amendments. And there's other, if you get one of them, you can find all the Brown unions and follow them, see what's happening. The undergrad unionization stuff is so interesting. And they are really awesome people as well. And just seeing, undergrad students do a lot of work too, not just grad students and postdocs. But those are the two main places. We do try to update our bargaining tracker every time we have bargaining. It's kind of been in stasis because, we're obviously negotiating stuff with them right now, but they've been holding on to. We actually submitted, for example, our compensation package in July of 2024, and we got the first thing back 2 weeks ago. So that's just how fun they've been to work with. But yeah, those are the two major places that you can find us.
Perfect. And again, all that will be in the show notes below on all platforms as well. And go ahead and pick a song, whether it's one that you listen to at union drive, union efforts, or if it's just your favorite song of the day. Just pick a song to play us out here for the end of the show.
I think the theme song of being a postdoc, and I heard it, I almost laughed, is probably Stressed by Silverstein.
Okay.
So I have to go with that. That is, I listened to it and I was like, wow, if that ain't my job.
Perfect. Well, and yeah, it's a good kind of thing from circling back from the original start of the episode. So yeah, we'll play Stressed.
And I'm
from
even
Silverstein.
wearing a Silverstein.
Yeah, perfect.
Sweatshirt.
We'll play Stressed from Silverstein to end out the Powerless podcast. Caroline, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. It was great talking to you today.
Maybe I'm stressed from the pressure. Either I die or I live forever. Maybe I bend or I snap like a fracture. Either I die or I live forever. It would hurt less if I let go of all the bullshit that I can't know. But I'm a mess, I'm a waste, I'm a lost cause. I'm addicted to making it my fault. You can have it all, you can have it all. You can trust me, I will detonate everything that I create. Maybe I'm stressed, maybe I'm stressed. Maybe I'm stressed from the pressure. Either I die or I live forever. Maybe I bend or I snap like a fracture. Either I die or I live forever. Maybe I'm stressed from the pressure. Either I die or I live forever. Maybe I bend or I snap like a fracture. Either I die or I live forever. Try to focus, get my head right. Just avoid it and waste more time. I'm a fake, I'm a fraud, I'm a con man. I'm the goat, I'm a god, I am Baphomet. Take it all away, take it all away. You can trust me, I will suffocate every single breath you take. Maybe I'm stressed from the pressure. Either I die or I live forever. Maybe I bend or I snap like a fracture. Either I die or I live forever. Yeah, maybe I'm stressed from the pressure. Either I die or I live forever. Maybe I bend or I snap like a fracture. Either I die or I live forever. Another day, pushed to the limit. It's all I can take. This place is a sickness. When all these voices get so loud, just let me hear some of the stressed out music. Turn it up, turn it up. Stressed out music. Come on, just give me that stressed out music. Yeah, yeah, shut my brain off. Stressed out music. Maybe I'm stressed, maybe I'm stressed. Maybe I'm stressed from the pressure. Either I die